Matthew 1, verses 1 to 6. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And then back to Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." And then chapter 4, starting in verse 9. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all those at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Being an outsider is rough. I remember earlier this late summer or early fall, I was at a Cubs game. Caleb and I were there. My son Caleb and I, we were there with Mike and Colin Kramer. It was a great game. The Cubs scored almost 20 runs, and it just was one of those games you love to go to. And Wrigley was, as usual, awash in Cubby blue. But a few rows ahead of us, there was a couple of fans from the other team wearing the other team's colors and the other team's jerseys. And while the people at Wrigley in our section were, I would say, generally polite, yet there was enough razzing as the Cubs put up all those runs that these guests, these intruders, these outsiders were made to know that the friendly confines are a lot friendlier if you're wearing Cubby blue. It was at least made to be a little uncomfortable for the outsider. Or perhaps a bit more seriously, I can identify quite easily with being an outsider. Until I was about 9 years old, my family lived in Bolingbrook. My dad was an FBI agent. He was stationed in Chicago. But when I was the summer between 4th and 5th grade, my dad got a transfer to the Milwaukee office, and so we moved to a very small town called Hingham, Wisconsin. And Hingham was so small, only about 500 people at the time, that there was no school. So I went to school in a town called Oostburg, Wisconsin, where I went to high school and all the way through graduation, and that's Oostburg. I can still recall very well. Oostburg was founded by Dutch immigrants quite some time ago, and it's like a lot of other small towns founded by Dutch immigrants. A lot of strengths, strong families, strong values, a strong sense of community, and great bakery. Very good bakery. But like other small towns, immigrant-based, there are weaknesses as well. I think perhaps the greatest of those weaknesses is that it's a very difficult town to break into. Difficult place really to feel like you belong. I moved there in the 5th grade. I'm Dutch. I went to a Reformed church. My family has a very long history there. There have been very, very, very many coppers in the area of Oostburg across the days. And yet, I didn't really feel like I fit in. Didn't really feel like I belonged until the 11th grade. Being an outsider can be rough. I've had opportunity to speak with many of you who work in the trades or work in industry, and I've had opportunity to know that you perpetually feel like an outsider. You feel the reality of the difference between you and the people of the world day in and day out, 9 to 5 or longer, all the time. You're a perpetual outsider. Or perhaps you've lived abroad, and you've lived in lands that are not your own, and you know very well what it is to not even speak the language, to not share the culture, to not have these people be your people, to feel like you stick out like a sore thumb. Maybe you're visiting this morning, and you are acutely aware that this is not normal for you, that you are an outsider here. Or maybe you're here this morning, or you'll listen online one day or watch online one day, and you will become aware that this God is not your God. And His people are not your people. You are a stranger and an outsider to this God and to His people. If that is the case, I want you to listen very carefully. Because the genealogy of Jesus, far from being boring or irrelevant, speaks to us very plainly that Jesus is a Savior for outsiders. And that Jesus has such grace that He would take those who are on the outside of His people, on the outs with God, and make them to be insiders and use them for glorious things. Ruth was an outsider. In fact, if you look at the first 3 ladies we've looked at so far in Jesus' genealogy, they're all outsiders. You have 2 Canaanites and a Moabite. The Moabites were descendants of Abraham's nephew, Lot. And the genesis of the Moabites is a genesis of scandal, and there's enough scandal in the genealogy already not to go looking for it elsewhere. You can read the story of the origin of the Moabites in Genesis 30 at your own leisure. But the Moabites were not the covenant people of God. They were outsiders to the covenant. They had an on-again, off-again friendly relationship with the people of God. But when the people of God, the Israelites, were coming up out of Egypt, they passed by the land of Moab, but the crowd, the nation of Israel was so great, was so large, that it terrified the Moabites so much that they went off and hired a sorcerer, Balaam, to cast a curse upon the Israelites. This was not always a friendly relationship between these two different peoples. The Moabites had their own gods, they had their own culture, they had their own tradition, they had their own stories, and they were not Israelites. They did not share in Israel's God, nor did they share in the experience of salvation out of Egypt. They were outsiders. Ruth was an outsider. But as God so often does, He uses the events of providence, even painful events, to bring His people to the point of coming into His people. You think of Rahab. According to God's providence, those two Israelite spies went and stayed at her house. Among all the houses in the city of Jericho, they stayed at her house. For Ruth, it was a famine. There's a famine in the land of Israel. There was no food. So Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons go traveling off to Moab for survival. And while they're there, Elimelech dies, and Mahlon and Chilion happen to marry two Moabite women, one of whom is Ruth. The Lord uses all kinds of things that appear on the outside to be disasters to accomplish His purposes. A famine in this case, a cross, in the ultimate case. But it's through the famine that Ruth the Moabitess comes into interaction, comes into relationship with those who belong to God. But while they're in Moab, not only Elimelech dies, but then both of Naomi's sons die, leaving Naomi and Orpah and Ruth widowed, poor, and vulnerable. Can you imagine their distress? Having no one to provide and no one to protect. And so Naomi hears that there's food again back home. And she decides that there's no reason to be here in Moab any longer. I'm going to return home. So she sets off, and both her daughters-in-law say they're going to come. But she implores them, she prevails upon them, no, to stay here. Find husbands. Live among your own people. Why would you cast your lot with me? I'm poor. I have nothing to offer you. I can't have any more sons to offer you. There is nothing here for you. Stay here. I will go. You be Moabites. I'll be an Israelite. In hindsight, it's really terrible advice. But she's in grief. But the two daughters-in-law say, no, we will go with you. We will be with your people. But then she tells them again, no, you stay here. I will go alone. And just like the story of Tamar is a story of contrast, and the story of Rahab is a story of contrast, so too the story of Ruth is a story of contrast. Because Orpah stays, but Ruth goes. We read that in verse 14. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. As we read the interaction in verses 15 through 17, you see that Ruth clings more than just to Naomi. But Ruth clings to Naomi's God and to Naomi's people. Look at verses 15 through 17. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Did you catch that? Ruth is a Moabitess. Moabites are different people from Israelites. They have different traditions, different cultures. They have different gods from the God of Israel. And so when Naomi says, "You stay here and be a Moabite, I'll go there and be an Israelite," Ruth says, "No, I will go with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." She has found something in Naomi, in Naomi's people, but principally in Naomi's God that is worth leaving everything else behind to have. She's going to leave her culture, everything she's ever known, her land, her home, whatever is left of her family. She's going to leave it all behind to travel with an old widow back to a land that she's probably never even been to. Because she has found something worth having in Naomi, Naomi's people, and Naomi's God. In this, Ruth is a perfect foreshadow of the kind of disciple that Jesus calls. Remember the story of the rich young ruler. For so long as we are together, we will not forget it. Jesus meets this rich young ruler, and he says, "Good teacher, what must I do to have eternal life?" Jesus says, "You know the commandments." The guy says, "I've kept all of those." Jesus says, "One thing you lack. Sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." The call to discipleship is the call to view everything else in life as expendable compared to the glory of having God. And that rich young ruler failed. He would prefer to have his wealth than to have Christ. But in every way that he failed, Ruth succeeds. She's willing to leave everything to have Naomi, Naomi's people, and Naomi's God. Do you see the contrast between these two people? He's an Israelite. He's a he. He's wealthy, self-righteous. She's a Moabite. A woman, widowed, and poor. But he's damned. And she's in the kingdom. She's a perfect example of faithfulness to the call to discipleship. And so she goes off to Israel, a land not her own, to a people not her own, and we might say that Ruth becomes an immigrant. And the remainder of the story tells us how Ruth goes from being a widowed immigrant Moabite to being grafted into the people of God in entirety, perfectly becoming a member of the people of God. And it all begins as we come in chapter 2, verse 3, this way. As it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz. As it turns out is biblical tongue-in-cheek code for according to God's providence. She finds herself working in the field of a man named Boaz. God, by His grace, leads Ruth when she's there with no way to provide for herself. He leads Ruth to a field owned by a man named Boaz who loves the Lord, who obeys the Lord, and who loves and obeys the law of the Lord. And so she finds herself in this field and she's picking up heads of grain in exactly the way that the law of the Lord had commanded the Israelites to allow immigrants, widows, and orphans to do. If you look at the word, if you look at the law of the Lord, you see the Lord has particular concern for those who are down and out. That He cares for those who are outsiders, continually and regularly showing mercy and compassion and grace to those who otherwise would be scorned and left for dead. And He shows particular concern for immigrants, or as the NIV calls them, aliens, as the ESV calls them, sojourners. And he reminds us that we are called to love the immigrant and the sojourner. And he reminds us that we are called to that because we were one of them. That we, the people of God, are of immigrant stock. That when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees and traveled up the Euphrates and then down into the land of Canaan, he was a sojourner. That eventually he would sojourn into Egypt, and then later his great-grandsons would sojourn down into Egypt themselves, that they would live in a land not their own for 400 years. We should not forget, of course, that Jesus himself, fleeing from Herod, was an immigrant or a refugee in Egypt for quite some time before returning back to the land of Galilee. God tells Abraham in Genesis 15, verse 3, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants theirs." We see again and again and again the people of God find themselves without a home in a country that is not their own. And so God in His law enshrines protection and mercy and grace for these people. Even in the heart of the law, in the very heart of the law, in the fourth commandment, we see that God provides for those who do not belong, according to the flesh, in His people. Exodus 20, the fourth commandment, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. God mercifully provides His people with one day off. With one day where they don't have to feel guilty about not being in the fields. With one day where they get to cease from toil and labor and strife. With one day of blessed, glorious, God-ordained rest. It's mercy. And He commands that mercy not just for them and for their children, but even for the immigrant living in their land. You see that He has protection for these people as well. Exodus 22 says, "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry." But it's more than just passively being merciful. But God's law commands active love towards the outsider. In Leviticus 23, verse 22, we read this, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." That last passage is precisely what we find Ruth doing when we come to her experience in Boaz's field. She has nothing. She has to go out into somebody else's field and go off behind his servants and try to pick up the little pieces of grain that are left and put them into some kind of a cloth bag, and she goes and she just has to eke out some kind of a meager existence with what the servants had left behind when they went through to harvest the field. But the average Israelite in the time of the judges would have disobeyed Leviticus, would have gone and harvested right up to the very ends and sent the servants back a second time or a third time to get all the grain possible out of the field. Make sure that everything has been gathered in, that there's nothing left, because you never know when a famine might come again, right? We need security. But not Boaz. Boaz loves the Lord and loves the word of the Lord. And so Boaz makes sure that his servants go through the field just one time and leave enough for other people to survive on. He's willing to take a hit on his bottom line, that this Moabite widow who finds herself in his field might survive. Just pause there for a moment and leave the story off. What does Matthew tell us in including these first three ladies? Canaanite, a resident of Jericho, and a Moabite. They're women, but more than that, they're outsiders. They're not descendants of Abraham according to the flesh. They're outsiders. And yet, God shows us how by His grace, He takes these people who by all right should be excluded from His people, and he brings them in. And he grafts them in. So much so that not only are they becoming Israelites, but they become grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and great-great-grandmothers of the finest of Abraham's sons, of the great King David, and the great King of Kings, Jesus. Ruth is no exception. She marries an Israelite man. She has Israelite son, and she becomes the great-grandmother to the greatest of Israel's kings. These women, by all rights, are outsiders to the kingdom, but God includes them. He makes them part of his people, descendants of Abraham, heirs to his promise. And Matthew makes this point very plainly, and we see it again in the very next chapter. If you would look at Matthew chapter 2, you see that when Matthew records who it is that came to visit Jesus, he records not any Jewish man or anybody like that. He records that it was Magi from the east, people from pagan lands, from Iran, Persia, Pakistan. And they travel that star, as the story goes, as we know so well. They travel following that star, and they find themselves in Bethlehem of all places, where these foreigners bow down to offer gifts and worship to Israel's king. It's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that outsiders are in chapter 1 and that outsiders are in chapter 2. It's intentional. Matthew wants us to see. He needs us to see that Jesus does not come just for Jews or for men or for the wealthy and the powerful or the righteous, but he comes for Jew and Gentile, for Canaanites, for Moabites, for women, for the widowed and the poor, and for the unrighteous. The story of Ruth is a beautiful story. It's a story of romance between Ruth and Boaz. It's a story of survival against all odds. It's a story of triumph in the face of great tragedy. It's a great story. But the greatest part of the story, I think, is at the very end, when you come to the genealogy the author of Ruth includes. It's at the genealogy, when you recognize that Ruth becomes included in the line of the kings of Israel, that the story really changes. When you see that it's through Ruth that God is going to bring about the birth of his great king, and through Ruth the birth of the eternal king, that the story changes. As one commentator says, the simple, clever human story of two struggling widows takes on a startling new dimension. It becomes a bright, radiant thread woven into the fabric of Israel's larger national story. When you come to the genealogy at the end of Ruth, and you see that same genealogy mirrored at the beginning of Matthew, you recognize that the story of Ruth is not just the story of God saving a couple of widows, but it's the story of God saving his world and using them to do it. What a God we serve. Can you figure him out? Can you figure out this God? I can't figure out this God. If I was going to write the story of Ruth, I don't know that it would turn out exactly like this. Would you choose, if you were God, would you choose to use Ruth in how you were going to bring about the birth of your son? I don't think that I would. I don't think that I'm clever enough or wise enough to figure out that the best way to accomplish this is by going off to Moab and finding a widow. But God does. God takes this Moabite widow and he uses her. And if you had been in Israel, the first day that Ruth comes into Israel for the first time, back with Naomi, if you had been there, you would have seen Ruth and thought, this is a woman who is in need of mercy and who is in need of pity and whose odds of survival are pretty slim, and you would have been right. But you also probably would have thought, there's nothing glorious about this woman at all. On that score, you would have been terribly wrong. This is a woman that God had chosen to use to bring about the birth of His Son. Of all the women in Israel, He did not use any of them to be the wife of Boaz, but He chose Ruth. If we didn't know better, we might say that it was foolish. Who would choose her? But God has a habit of using the foolish things to shame the wise. As one commentator says, without this Moabite girl, Christianity would be without its founder. Israel and the world would be immeasurably the poorer. God has a habit of using things that seem foolish in wise ways. We see that in 1 Corinthians 1. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Which of us, if we were to pen the story of the salvation of the world, which of us would have put at the very center of the story God's Son on a cross? Not me. But God did. And we should be grateful. Because again, without that, and if He hadn't, you and I would be immeasurably, eternally the poorer. I think there are a couple lessons for us here. The first is for the one who is an outsider to God and to His people. And the lesson is very plain. God beckons you to come. He invites you to come. God is always inviting outsiders to come to Him, and to become a part of His people. To be able to say with Ruth, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. The sign out front often carries a very simple message. You belong here. And it's true. It's true not because anybody who is an outsider to the church is essential to us. It's not true because people outside are so great and wonderful and magnificent that we just have to have them, or that God just has to have them. It's true because God has long been in the work of taking outsiders and making them insiders. And God has long been in the work of showing His great love to those who have great need. Ruth was included in the people of God when she made that great profession. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. For the outsider, it's much the same. You get to say with us and to us, you are my people. I am one of you. And your God is my God. And when that gloriously happens, you are as in as it gets. Because when you make that profession, you become adopted into the family of God. And there's no more in than that. But secondly, I think there's something for those of us who are already in. That oftentimes we need to check ourselves and check our own hearts. How is it that we relate to and think about the outsider? Whether that be the outsider in our land or the outsider as far as our church is concerned. How do we view outsiders? How do we view immigrants in our own day? I suspect that the average evangelical, if that word even means anything anymore, the average evangelical, if you just mentioned the word immigrant to them and you could read their minds, the first thing their mind would go to would be jobs, national security, financial security. What is the immigrant going to do or not do to our country or to my own livelihood? That we view immigrants, even those of us in the church, view immigrants as primarily a political issue. But we're not primarily political people. We are first and foremost the people of God. And we should be thinking first and foremost that perhaps, like Ruth, God is bringing people to us to have included in His people. That God brings the nations to us, to this place where there are all kinds of people who know the gospel and who love the gospel, who know the Word and love the Word, that these people who might never hear the gospel where they're from might come and hear it here. That we need to think first and foremost in gospel terms and only third or fourth or fifth or sixth in political terms. I'm not going to tell you my views on immigration because all of you would be upset with me at one point on the views. But I will say this. God commands us. God commands us to care for the outsider. He commands us to love the stranger. And He commands us to show hospitality and mercy and grace to all people, no matter where they have come from or what their status is. And if your first instinct on finding someone who is here illegal is to call the Border Patrol or INS, you have some serious problems in your priorities. Because our first reaction to hearing there's somebody stranger in our land, our first reaction ought to be gospel. How do I share the gospel with this person? And how can I be kind? Because I'm from immigrant stock. Not just because my Dutch ancestors traveled here 150 years ago or whatever. I'm of immigrant stock because I am a child of Abraham. And I share the story of Israel. And I belong to Christ, who was Himself a refugee. How can I share the gospel? That should be our first question. But then, what about outsiders to the church? What about outsiders to First Church? How do we take the clear teaching of Matthew when God includes Tamar and when God includes Rahab and when God includes Ruth the Moabite? How do we take that and what do we do? What do we do when God begins to send us people who are a lot like Tamar and a lot like Rahab and a lot like Ruth? When He sends outsiders who don't share our history or our culture or our background or our experiences, whose lives are a mess, what do we do then? Well, the Word of God commands us, compels us to disciple all people, that we are to love and care for and be kind to and share the gospel with and disciple all people, men and women, rich and poor, wherever they're from, whoever they are. If the Lord sends us foreigners, we make fully devoted followers of foreigners. The Lord sends us prostitutes like Rahab, we make fully devoted followers of prostitutes. If the Lord sends us people with crazy, whacked-out worldviews who've been so messed up by the world and everything else that they come to us and they don't know which way is up, we make fully devoted followers of crazy, whacked-out, messed up people. Teaching them with our words and our examples to follow Christ. No matter who the Lord sends us, we make fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ. Because God has long been in the business of taking some very strange people that you and I would never expect Him to use, except that we know Him, and bringing them into His people. And once He's done so, using them for great things. If God can take a widowed Moabite and put her in the line of His Son, what might He do with an outsider in our own day by the power of His Spirit and by His grace?